Okay, hello and welcome. I am in Chongqing. Welcome to another episode, and I am with Ben, who has opened up some craft beer bars here, and we'll just have a little chat as usual, like the new format that I've uploaded. And let's start by introducing yourself.
So my name is Ben Brown. I'm from Long Prairie, Minnesota, a town of 3,000 people now. We've grown by 500 in the last 20 years. And I came over here the first time in 1994 because my university in my undergrad school in Minnesota has a 35-year-old program sending students from central Minnesota to Bay,
Okay.
a little suburb outside of Chongqing, to go to Southwest University. So I came over in 1994 on that program, which was year 8, I think, of its operation, and then I liked it. I learned how to say hello, my name is Ben in Chinese, which later I figured out means hello, my name is stupid. I have a brother named Dan.
Yeah. Oh,
So
yeah.
Ben Dan, right? You and I have basically Ben Dan. So total idiot.
Yeah.
And so I went home and tried to give my mom a hard time. I was like, how could you name me stupid and him idiot? And without even thinking about it, she looked at me and said, was I wrong?
So that was a long time ago. It must have been very different at that
Yeah,
point.
it was really different. And I came back in 97 after I graduated from school. And when I came back in 97, I lost 5 kilos in the first month. I've always been a little overweight since basically the end of college. And then I went back to the States in 2001 to get an MBA, and instead I got a divorce, and then I got drunk for 3 years, and then I got an MBA.
Okay.
And so when I came back here in 2012,
Right.
After I finished school and spent some time with my family, I was all excited because I thought I'd lose weight again.
Yeah.
Gained 8 kilos in the first month.
You're used to the food now.
Yeah, well, I thought it was the food, but what I eventually figured out was that in 1997, none of the apartment buildings in Chongqing had elevators. So,
Oh, okay.
and,
Yeah.
in 2001, almost none of the buildings in Chongqing didn't have elevators.
Well, that probably emphasizes also, that's probably just the least of the differences. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
it must have been just like night and day.
Yeah, it really was. I remember in 2008, I came over to visit, and I think the subway was partially running, one of the lines. And in 2012, when I moved back here, I got on line 3 from the airport, and I was on it forever, and I was going towards Caotianmen, but I couldn't remember where Caotianmen was, so
Yeah.
I just chose to stop and got off, and I walked out of the subway stop, and there was this big bridge in front of me that I didn't recognize, and all these buildings around me that I didn't recognize, and I was trying to figure out what to do, and I turned around, and there was another bridge behind me that I hadn't even seen yet, and that was the original bridge that went from the north side to the central district across the river. And so between 2001 and 2012, they built a whole second bridge and turned it into, one bridge was southbound and the other bridge was northbound, whereas originally it was two-way on this one old bridge. So then I knew exactly where I was, and went from there. But yeah,
And
no,
this was in the city here, right? So
yeah, this was in the city, so there were no river roads like the
Right.
place where Taps opened. That didn't exist.
right.
Almost none of the buildings were over 10 stories high. The apartment buildings,
Yeah.
most of them were 10 stories or less,
Yeah.
because they had no elevators.
Were they at the first time you visited? Were they built up along the mountains like they are now, where you've got these multi-layered kind of?
Yeah, they were still built up along the mountains in areas, but like also Nanping was, that old amusement park that looks like a scene from a horror movie on the
I haven't been
south
there.
side. Okay.
I haven't been there.
Well, there's a very old amusement park with a Ferris wheel that I have not seen actually turn in 20 years. That was there in Nanping on the south side of the Yangtze River.
Yeah.
And then there were about 5 high-rise buildings down there, and that was it. And now Nanping is developed out for
Yeah.
what,
Well,
4 kilometers?
Yeah. Now, I mean, Minnesota, correct me if I'm wrong, it's fairly, like, topographically speaking, it's fairly flat,
Yeah.
isn't it? So, I mean, this must be like, I mean, even for me in Shenzhen, I mean, Shenzhen is mountains and stuff like that. I'm from Ontario, and it's pretty flat. And so I look at, like, Hong Kong and Shenzhen as kind of like a 3D city, but Chongqing is like 4D. It's like out of this world. And then the nightscapes, especially, the way I look at it, I've always said before that it's like a mix between Blade Runner and Gotham City.
Yeah, it really is.
And then, and just the multi-layeredness of it.
And I like to tell people when I have friends visiting, especially on the rare occasions that I have people who have been to my hometown, and we go down line 3 to go across the Jialing River, and we look out, and it comes out of a tunnel, and then you're immediately 35, 40 meters above the river. You just boom. And so you get to see the cityscape, and I point out across it, from the window, the light rail and or the monorail, and I say, that's like 25 of my hometown that you can see, population wise.
So when you go back now, does it feel really weird? Like you just feel like you're kind of...
No, not too bad. I actually, one of the biggest TikTok videos that we ever did, it was a true story. I went home with my wife in 2017 in the summer, and she had a headache. So I jumped in the car and I drove to the local grocery store across town. Took less than 5 minutes, and grabbed an aspirin, a bottle of Tylenol, and I get to the cashier, and we all know each other. It's 3,000 people, and she says that's $7, and I pulled out my phone, right, and then she looked at me and she said, "You want to trade your iPhone for a bottle of Tylenol? I mean, I'll barter with you if that's how you do things in China," because everybody knows I'm the guy that lives in China. So I was like, I'll be right back. So I got my car, drove, because I didn't even bring my wallet. Like I was just used to it. Yeah. So I drove home, got $10, come back down, give her $10, and she's like, "I don't understand you anymore." And I was like, it's a long story.
Yeah, so. No, it's really difficult to adjust. I mean everything, pretty much everything. I mean, we had to take our son to the hospital today, even to print out your CT scan results. You've got to scan something. You also pay with your WeChat. Everything is done by As a matter of fact, even in the toilets, when you want to get some toilet paper out, you scan with your WeChat, and it dispenses a certain amount of... I think the rations were a little bit stingy, especially considering the local cuisine. But it was still pretty interesting.
Where was this? This was at the hospital?
This was in the hospital, yeah.
Really?
I can't remember the hospital name. There's 2 of them, and they're supposed to be one of the top 3 children's hospitals, or a hospital for children-related issues in China. And I was like, that's a little bit comes out. And then, did you
have to pay for the...
No, it's free.
It's free. It's just you got to scan it to get...
I think it's sponsored by the tissue company, because the tissue company's logo's on there. You have to go into their official account to do it. And then it's better than a lot of the previous kind of ways things were done here was like a BYOTP. Yeah. So it's better than that, right?
Yeah.
But then when I remember, speaking of that 3D element to it, when we went across to the other building, we were on the ground floor of one building, then we had to go over to the CT building. And so we cross over like this little bridge. And so keep in mind, we're on the ground floor, and then we say, okay, so how do we get to the CT building? And they say, you got to go downstairs to the 2nd floor, or to the 4th floor. Like, what do you mean downstairs? We're on the ground floor. But we went across the other building, and now we're in a completely different layer of Chongqing.
Yeah.
It really is pretty amazing.
Yeah, I lived on the 7th floor of a building when I moved over here in 2012, and it was 1 story above the retail area. Like, to get into the building, you walk down to the back,
right?
And the 1st floor is down this very steep hill.
Yeah.
And then you get in and you go up to the 7th floor, and it was the retail space is 2 stories. So I was on the 3rd floor above the west side of the building's little shopping area, but the door of the building was another 4 stories below that or whatever. So, and the other things that are really interesting about living here and the changes technologically, especially, are things like right now we have a 2012 Chevy Cruze.
Okay.
That's the only thing I use a key for. Like we use a fingerprint to get into our apartment building,
right?
And I use WeChat to open the gate to the compound, and so it's and then I use WeChat to buy everything. So
Yeah.
I actually have cash in my wallet the last few days because I bought somebody some tortillas
Okay.
at Metro, and he gave me 100 RMB. And I was
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
what do I do with this?
Yeah.
It's like, you forgot how to use it? I'm like,
It's amazing how quickly it's changed, isn't it? Just
Yeah.
like, as soon as WeChat Pay came out, it's kind of like overnight, train tickets and everything like that.
Yep.
And then in terms of living in Chongqing, like, one of the things I always say that I like about Shenzhen is that it's a city of migrants where nobody's really from Shenzhen. There are some locals, there are some people from there, but more or less, it's a city where everybody's from somewhere else. And so we're kind of on an equal playing field. It's like we were all born somewhere else, but now we call this our home.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that it created a very welcoming environment compared to some other cities where they're a little bit more Paiwai, or, not necessarily. Everybody in China is pretty friendly with foreigners, but generally speaking, you feel like you're in their place. However, in Chongqing, I didn't really get that feeling. People are really friendly here.
Yeah, and in my experience, it's always been that way. I mean, since I came over in '94, people are extremely friendly and curious, and I've gotten to the point where I'm kind of used to it, and it's changed a little bit recently. Like when I was here in the '90s, I think there were maybe 500 foreigners here, and 99% of us were foreign teachers. There were no English training schools, so we were all at the university systems, and then there were almost no foreign students, very few foreign professionals. So people that like had fancy suits and fancy cars, which were very few, and a fancy car in the '90s was a Mercedes.
Yeah.
Would like run across the street to say hello in English to you, and then turn to their buddy and be like, "Oh, it worked," if you said hello back.
But what, actually, I get the sense though when I'm here that foreigners are still more kind of unusual here than in Shenzhen.
Oh yeah.
When I was parking here, there are kind of people looking at my car still and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, there is an expat population here, though, right? But it's
still very
nothing,
small. It's only about 6,000-7,000.
Yeah,
and that.
But they're curious and they're talking. I mean, even with other Chinese, like when we were in the hospital, there were two grandmas with one grandson who hurt his face or something like that. And the family situation here, both grandmas come out to take him. But they were talking with my wife also, and comparing notes about, oh, how did your son fall? Oh, ours is this, and oh, it should be no problem, and just really friendly. So open to outsiders, even other Chinese, because that's an important distinction also. There's a lot of places that I find, because again, foreigners are treated really well in China, I think, overall.
Yeah.
But that might not necessarily be the case for Chinese going somewhere else. Like I've heard, I don't want to name the cities because I don't want to implicate any cities.
Right.
But I've heard of like some Hunan friends going to a particular city and not being welcome. But here, seems like they're welcoming to everybody. But the thing that I'm curious about is that I would attribute that to like an open-mindedness. However, if you compare Chongqing to Chengdu in terms of new products and craft coffee, craft beer, it seems quite a lot more open-minded than Chongqing.
Yeah, my theory on that is that Chongqing, even more so than Sichuan province and Chengdu, has always kind of had its own unique, specific kind of independent culture, and I mean even the landscape, like you mentioned, is I mean, it's beautiful from almost anywhere. You can get in the 10th floor of a building and see across the whole city in a lot of areas. And so I lived in Shanghai and I lived in Chengdu for about 2 years each, and I loved living in Chengdu, especially because I could ride my bike everywhere. It's flat.
Right.
But I also missed being in this environment where you can go to a hot pot restaurant, you look out the window, and there's a river and a bridge and high rises that are below you and buildings that are above you. I mean, it's just, there's that. And then there's also like this kind of hot pot culture here that's much stronger than everywhere else. And I personally feel that, and I think they've earned it. Chongqing people have a very strong pride in what, in their cuisine and their culture.
They deserve it, I think. That's pretty good stuff.
Yeah, and so it's not so embracing of other outside cultural things, not just from like the States and Europe, but from other parts of China even. There's if you go to a Beijing Kaoya place, like a Peking duck place here, they serve a little bowl of soup. You can get like the malatang,
Okay. Yeah, it's like,
put, and so it's still hot pot basically.
yeah.
And then they bring out the Beijing duck, and it's not. I don't think it's as good as the Beijing duck in Beijing.
Right, yeah,
obviously,
it's like a localized version of it.
yeah, but at the same time, the Beijing duck in Beijing, if I recall correctly, does not include a personalized hot pot where you can continue to
Yeah,
cook
I mean,
everything.
yeah, you get that everywhere. I mean, when you have Chongqing food in Shenzhen, it's not really like Chongqing food. It's kind of been customized. There are some people that have tried to bring authenticity, but actually, even the people who really try to do genuine Chongqing style food in Shenzhen, and it seems like they're really trying, it still tastes different. And one thing I've heard one of my friends, local friends here, say this before, is that it's in the water also. And we, of course, appreciate that for brewing.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I mean, that could be, the pH that they're putting in the soups and stuff like that, the chemical makeup of the water. I mean, I don't know if there's anything to that.
I haven't had hot pot in other parts of China in a while. But even in Chengdu, when I lived there for a couple of years, the hot pot there is not as oily. It's not as spicy. It's a little toned down from what you get in general here. And there's just in Chinese they say 重口味, right?
Yeah.
There's this heavy, like I have a heavy appetite or whatever. And so Chongqing is kind of all the food, even if you go out and get like the Jianghu Cai, like Laziji or whatever, even the Huigoro and all this stuff, the traditional Sichuan dishes, in Chongqing, it just seems like it's always heavier, oilier.
Yeah, I mean, that might be
flavors.
deliberate, and I wonder, there could be an element that's related to the pH or the mineralization. I have a friend who is a Chongqing local. He was living in Hong Kong, moved back now, and he was mentioning that some of the secrets behind the hot pot in Chongqing is they remineralize it, just like we do with brewing. So adding calcium or something like that. And I guess
there's a high amount of calcium in the water here, very high.
So it's probably not calcium they're adding then. That might have been what he said was already present in the water here.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, they and I know that at the very least the noodles that they make here, they add. I think they make it more. Is it more alkaline where the elasticity is?
That I think that's what he was telling me about.
Yeah.
Changing the alkalinity of the noodles.
Yeah.
Right.
They raise which would be, I guess, raising the pH.
Yeah.
So it's not. It's funny when I think in terms of water because I make beer, and because I started making beer really in China.
Yeah.
I think of it as Jan and Swan and not alkaline and acidic. So
yeah.
They increase the alkalinity in the water for noodles at any rate.
That's interesting. An interesting topic I want to touch on too, because you have learned more or less most of your brewing here, and so your brewing terminology and references are all in Chinese.
Yeah,
so
it's Chinese and the metric system, which I've grown to love. But when I go on to like a Beersmith app or if I'm researching recipes, a lot of it, the home brewing population in the United States has got to be huge compared to the rest of the world. And I can occasionally find some British sites where people have done things in the metric system, but for the most part, it's pounds and gallons. And then I got to convert everything to liters and grams and
I'm lucky.
kilos.
It's the same in Canada. It's like we're good to go.
Yeah. But I mean, that's kind of, I guess that's a good tie into the introduction of how I got started. With the brewing, I lived in Seattle from 2001 to 2010.
That's
basically.
a good place to be for craft beer.
And I never made any beer there because there was no reason to.
Yeah.
Like, there was craft beer in every. I mean, I played a lot of hockey because I grew up in Minnesota, so the Canada Light, as I refer to it. And so I when I was in Seattle, I played on a bunch of hockey teams, and there was always a bar next to the rink. And in Seattle, the bar next to the rink had 4 or 5 different craft beers on tap always. So then I moved back over here in 2012, and I couldn't even buy an imported bottle of IPA anywhere.
Yeah.
Like, it was just nothing.
And the ones that were coming in, they weren't handled well with
No.
shipping.
And so I started learning to make my own because I couldn't go back. you know.
Yeah.
And then I met a guy actually. I worked here for 9 months. I had a chance to go use my MBA in Beijing and Shanghai, and I came back to Chongqing and taught English to kids because I had guanxi here. You know, I had friends that I'd known since 1994.
Yeah.
They've kept in touch, and so I felt like if I really wanted to move forward and have an experience that was valuable to me in China, I had to come to Chongqing. 9 months later, they helped me find a job in Chengdu, so I went over to Chengdu, and that's where I met a guy named Brian who had been brewing for at least 15 years at the time, and he was a few credits shy of a PhD in biochemistry. So,
oh, wow, okay.
So he knew beer on a molecular level.
Yeah.
And he and I and a guy from Liverpool named Pat started a homebrew club over there. And it was funny because Pat brought in people because he's very gregarious, and Brian taught everybody how to do everything, and I kind of helped take some of the edge off of Brian's instructions to people, because he could be a little
technical.
bit caustic. Yeah, well, it would just, I mean, the first time I brewed with him, he has a kind of a dry sense of humor, and I'd do something and he'd say, "What the fuck are you doing?" And I'm like, "I don't know, man, tell me." and then he would kind of get a little bit frustrated with my lack of knowledge, and especially if he'd already told me a couple of times, which I later found out is true in my marriage as well. My wife is a little bit similar in that regard. I already told you 6 times. Why can't you just do it? So the three of us got along really, really well. And we brought in people that liked kind of the energy of it and enjoyed brewing. And then after about maybe 6 or 8 months of us all making beer together, one night we were all drinking homebrew that we'd all made. We'd have get-togethers, and he said he was trying to put Sichuan pepper into beer. I served a glass of it to a lawyer, a Chinese lawyer, who has now made a few batches of beer himself.
Okay.
He's just one of those guys who has a great palate, and he took one sip of it, and he's like, "Well, I'm no expert, but this needs to be sweeter." And I was like, "All right."
So to complement the flavor and kind of
yeah, some of the sweetness, and that's when I finally figured out. I mean, when you get especially in China, but I think everywhere, if you get a double IPA, it's generally not going to be as bitter as a regular IPA, because when you're using that much grain to up the alcohol content, you're going to end up with more sugar,
right,
the sweeter beer, and you can't put in enough hops to make it bitter again.
Yeah.
And well, I mean, maybe they figured out how since I left. It's been a while, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that you use that high sugar content in imperial stouts and double IPAs to mask the flavor of the alcohol. If you've got something that's 12%, you don't want to feel like you're drinking beer that's been spiked with vodka.
Right. Yeah.
And so when we sweetened it up a bit, it was never a very strong beer, but when we sweetened it up a bit, it got rid of that.
Yeah. And so that's one of your core beers now.
Yeah, that's been up until very recently. That's been responsible for about, I'd say, 60% of all the beer we sell.
Oh wow!
Like,
that was worth figuring out then.
Yeah, and when we first opened, like, I was working at a German engineering company. I don't think I'm supposed to say the names.
Yeah.
I was working on a project with a German motorcycle manufacturer.
Okay. Yeah.
And a Chinese motorcycle manufacturer to design an assembly line for a motorcycle engine. And when that project ended, the engineering company, the consulting firm, asked me to move to Shenyang. And I said, I just bought a house, and my wife and I just had a kid. We really don't want to go to Shenyang.
Yeah.
And they said, well, we don't have any other contracts for you here, so what are you going to do? And I said, well, I just met 25 German engineers. I'll open a bar, and they'll float. They'll come in every Saturday and pay our rent until we can figure out what to do.
That's interesting.
I
want to get back to the language part also, though, because now it's interesting that you've learned a lot of vocabulary in Chinese, and you almost have to pause to translate it back into English now.
Yeah.
And but one thing I noticed, I saw one of your videos that was posted online, the one you recommended, and it's almost like you have a Chongqing accent.
Yeah, I have what they call Chuanpu, Sichuan Putonghua. So
when you travel elsewhere in China, people must find that really interesting.
I haven't traveled since we opened the bar,
Okay.
but it's gotten a lot thicker since we opened the bar. But yeah, I mean, when I came over here in '97, I met this woman from Ireland, and we were at a bar in Jiefan Bay, and we chatted for a minute or two, and I hadn't said where in the States I was from, and she interrupted me and said, "Have you seen that movie Fargo?" Because at the time I had a strong Minnesota accent.
Oh, okay.
And so it took years of practice to get it to the point where now sometimes people ask me if I'm from Canada.
Okay. Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, a little bit, because I still say and
Yeah.
and things like that.
Oh, yeah, eh?
Yeah, and it's a little bit different, but it's not all that much.
Yeah.
So then when I came over, I mean, I learned to speak Chinese in Chongqing, and I learned it from
Yeah, so you're
going
going to pick up the accent. When you mentioned the Irish friend, I something clicked, and it's like I would almost consider like the Chongqing accent like the Irish language of, or the Irish accent of China.
Yeah.
Almost.
Yeah, and it probably is. I always tell people that if you meet somebody who has a strong Southern American accent, they either sound like a redneck or they sound really, really sexy. And at least in my opinion. And then if you go up the coast a little bit, you get to New York, everybody sounds like they're kind of annoyed with you. And then if you go further up the coast to Boston, everybody sounds like they just want to fight with you immediately. And then if you go west over to Minnesota, suddenly everybody sounds kind of slow in the head. And I'm proud of that. I mean, a lot of people don't go to Minnesota. It's not a popular destination.
Duluth is in
Minnesota.
Yeah.
And we were actually, my wife and I, when we're bored, we look at housing prices in the States, and Duluth is amazingly inexpensive.
Yeah, I mean, it's right up there, isn't it?
Yeah.
I remember, I know Duluth because of two reasons. There was, I used to be into competitive inline skating, and they have a race there every year.
Nice.
And then also Duluth Trading Company.
Yeah.
It was a great company with some good stuff.
Housing prices there are so affordable, and what you can get is amazing. And it's like Chongqing, really. It's very hilly. You get a great view of this huge lake that looks like an ocean.
The question is, though, I mean, you're here in a city like this with such a big population, that by no means automatically means doing business here is going to be easy.
Right.
But it's like you've got a big population to work with. And you move somewhere like that, it's all of a sudden, it's like, well, of course, I mean, you could do a national business, more online based or something like that. But you start to think, it's like, 30 million, 35 million people in Canada. When I think of that, it's like, that's how many people are in my garden.
Right. Right. Exactly. And we, I mean, I don't know if we're going to move back anytime soon, but we generally, we feel like if we're able to make the beer business work and at the same time continue building a following on social media, then it makes more sense to stick around.
This is a place you could see. I mean, but providing you set something up sustainable and it keeps going. This is somewhere you could see just staying, just living.
Easily.
I mean, it's the same for me in Shenzhen. I mean, Shenzhen has become a very expensive city, and we've got a few kids, so to put them, especially through international school. But as long as it's sustainable for us, I also see the same thing.
Yeah.
It's even to the point where I actually do suffer from that reverse culture shock that people talk about when you go back. I mean, especially when you look at the pace that things have changed here, you feel like you're just walking back into the past when you go home.
Yeah,
it's kind of everything's stayed still. Yeah, and it's a difficult thing. I mean, do you drive here also? Or?
Yeah.
And driving also, you've got to re-switch.
Yeah, and I actually find. I grew up on a farm. Yeah. Well, not on a farm. My dad was a lawyer, but in a farm town, and so I did chores at friends' houses at 5 a.m, and I helped bale hay and pick rock and do all that crap. So I got to drive tractors in high school and 4-wheel drive trucks through the woods and things like that. So when I first got I don't know if you're the same way, but when I first got my driver's license over here, I was really nervous because people drive somewhat insane here.
Yeah.
And then I started getting on the roads, and it suddenly occurred to me that, like, when I was here in the 90s, almost nobody owned their own car. And if you saw a car on the road, it was generally a black Santana Volkswagen.
Right.
And it just was almost the only drivers on the road were professionals. There were taxi drivers, truck drivers, bus drivers. And so really China, at least Chongqing's car explosion probably happened within the last 10 or 15 years.
Yeah.
And if you assume that at least half those people didn't own cars 5 years ago,
it creates,
yeah, then you get to a point where the average driving experience in Chongqing for anybody that's not driving a taxi is probably less than 5 years.
Yeah, I find that too, but it creates an interesting dynamic though, where everyone here is expecting that everyone else, nobody's going to follow the rules. Somebody's going to pull out, somebody's going to do something wrong, and it creates, you're less likely to go into this autopilot mode like you do overseas, where you're just trusting that everybody on the road is going to follow the rules. And so, just people are more alert. And with that said, also, if you happen to make a mistake on the road one day, everybody's prepared for it.
Yeah. Yeah, and the other thing I think is that traffic moves at a much slower rate of speed here, at least in the cities.
Yeah, I've noticed that too.
In the States, it's also, I think, it's also, in the States, we went through this phase, like where people were just getting vehicles and people were learning that the value of their car is enough such that you don't want to drive like an idiot. And so we're used to moving at higher speeds and following traffic laws, because when somebody runs a red light in the States, the results can be catastrophic.
Yeah.
Whereas here, people are used to, like you said, they're used to it. They're ready for it. And it also keeps traffic speeds slower. And you can kind of see, like I was comfortable after about 2 weeks, because you can see when people are getting ready to do something I would only do when I was 17. You know?
Yeah, you can see it. You can see when they're creeping out. You're like, this guy's not going to stop.
Yeah, he's going to pull it.
And so I have a cross-border car, so I go across to Hong Kong sometimes too. And Hong Kong, you've got to totally switch gears.
Yeah.
It's like if you pull out and you're not careful, they're just going to hit you.
So do you sit on the left side?
Yeah,
the steering wheel?
Yeah, exactly. So I was nervous about that, because first of all, I had never driven on. So when you're sitting in the car, you're on the right side.
Yeah.
And so the first element was I've never driven on that. I drove once in Australia for a couple of weeks, and then once in Thailand, but I was nervous about driving on that side of the street because I wasn't used to it. But then to further compound that, when I drive back to China, you're driving on the right side, but for this system in China. So you can imagine when you're turning left, you kind of can't see around. I was nervous about that piece, but it's worked out okay.
Oh, so the steering wheel in your car is on the right side?
Yeah. So just like in England. So it's on the right. It's on the right side.
Yeah.
So that's what I meant. And then so when you're driving here, where you're driving on the right side of the road, also it causes all kinds of,
because you're way over on the by the
you
shoulder.
Can't see around. Yeah. But it's not as bad as I imagined it. But the main thing is, though, mannerisms wise, when you go into Hong Kong, you've got to completely switch. You got to totally switch gears.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, but I've gotten, for the most part, pretty acclimated here. I mean, I enjoy living here, and after we started doing the whole TikTok Douyin thing, that was actually my wife's idea. She made a film. I still remember the first video we put out that was popular, that had a whole bunch of views. Was just a 15-second clip where I said, in Chinese, I said, I came over here, and people ask me where I'm from, and my town only has 3,000 people. And they say, well, doesn't it make you feel uncomfortable living in a city this big? And I'd say, not really, because my hometown has Sanqian, right? And Chongqing has Sanqian 1. So it's really just one extra character. There's only one character's difference between 3,000 and 30 million in Chinese. So, so that was just a funny, stupid joke, but people liked it. So
that's good. And that one
kind of viral, and then we had a bunch of followers, and then we did a video one night. There was a group of students from my undergrad that were coming over on an entrepreneurship trip, and they asked what all the yelling was about in the hot pot restaurants. And it's this game called Huatren, where it's a Chongqing game. They have a few versions of it in other parts of the country, but in Chongqing it's very popular. And it's basically paper, rock, scissors on crack.
And you got to count the total numbers together.
Yeah, you throw out a number between 0 and 5. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And you yell a number between 0 and 10. And your opponent does the same thing at the same time.
Yeah.
And then it goes very fast, and you usually don't guess right. So you go until somebody guesses right, and you don't tie. If you both guess the right
and it's
number.
usually tied in with drinking also. You got to drink. If,
whoever finally loses has to drink. If you screw up, you have to drink.
Yeah.
If you and the way that we used to play at any rate was, it would be in hot pot, and there'd be 10 guys, and each person would play all the way. Every 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. You go all the way around. You play everybody, and then after you're done, then the guy to your left goes all the way around, plays everybody. But they had this rule that if you lost every single game, or if you won every single game, you didn't lose a single game, you had to go around again. If you lost every single game, you also had to go around again.
Oh, okay.
So you could get very inebriated very quickly, and so they were like, "What's all the yelling?" These
it
students.
gets loud, doesn't it?
Yeah, and me and a buddy of mine who's been here for 8 years and also came over originally on the same program. He was like, he and I explained it, and they said, "Well, it sounds kind of stupid. I mean, it's just paper, rock, scissors." And we're like, "We'll show you."
Yeah.
So it's me and this other fat white guy from Minnesota, from the States. He's from Colorado, and we're playing and we're screaming at each other in Chongqing dialect, and I'm going very quickly. And we both won one, and then somebody had filmed it, and they sent it to my wife, and she put it on WeChat, and then somebody took it off of WeChat and put it on Weibo. And the next morning, and they tagged me on it, and the next morning, it had like 30,000 views or something.
I think I've heard of that one. Yeah, I think I've heard of that video.
And so then a guy came in and made a little documentary and put that on Weibo and increased it from 17 seconds to 30 seconds, and that got something like 8 million views. I don't know, like
so
a
that
lot.
must have been the one I heard about.
Probably
I think,
it had Chinese characters on it, and sound effects and stuff, and then based on that, more people started coming into the bar, and then we got up to 120,000 followers on Douyin, and we kind of plateaued for a bit, and then this group called Argon came in, and they do documentaries around China. They've got a chapter in every city, and so the Chongqing chapter of Argon came in and did a documentary, and then that got put on the subway system and the bus system. So suddenly I was on all the buses in the city,
awesome.
and the subways. And I remember one of my friends on WeChat sent me a message, and he's like, a picture of me on a subway TV, and he's like, "How much did this cost you?" And I said, "I'm on the subway." So, and then Argon is there. That group has there's another group called Li Siping, which is like pear or something. Okay. And they came over and did another documentary, and they also have an agreement with the metro system. So I got put on the subway again, and then I got put on the subway a third time when they re-aired it. And it was only the third time that I was smart enough finally to actually go to the subway and take a picture of myself in front of a picture of myself. But all of that worked really well. And then the Douyin thing, we figured out how to unplateau ourselves, and we went home for Christmas a year ago, and I filmed a bunch of stuff back home, and then that grew us up to 430,000 followers.
Wow, that's amazing. So do you get recognized outside now sometimes?
Yeah, every day.
Wow.
And then we got up to 430,000, and we went. We came back to Chongqing, and from January 3rd of this year until late August, we lost like 10,000 followers. Like, we couldn't grow, and we finally found a manager at Douyin who told us you have to film at least 20 videos a month in order for it to
I've heard that from YouTubers also. I heard it from, what's his name, the PewDiePie. He says, I remember seeing a video of his where he says this is the kind of thing that you've really got to stay on top of.
Yeah.
So it must be... It's
part of the algorithm now. They require that you do a lot of videos. So we have, like, tonight, I didn't manage my time well, so I'm going to end up running back home, and then we'll do some stupid one where I'm dancing. And it's going to get, like, 12,000 views, and nobody's going to like it, and we won't really lose any followers, but we won't gain any followers, but we'll get 20, and so we have to, just to get to 20 views, so that we can have a chance of putting out something that gets over 1 million views. We occasionally have to put out crap, which is why we're trying to find
That's
group,
interesting. I suppose
you know.
that's probably the case for a lot of people. They don't see what goes on behind the scenes. That you've got to do all this stuff, and they
Yeah.
only see the hit. There was there's a podcast I really like called Hidden Brain, and they were
Oh
talking.
yeah, I listened to that too. Yeah.
So there was one episode, I believe it was Hidden Brain, where they were talking about. I think it was an episode on grit. And it was like, some people assume that some people are just successes. Everything they do is a success.
Yeah.
And people like to believe that, and they'd like you to believe that too, because they don't want you to see all of those failures that went on behind the scenes.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really interesting because they even showed that actually of the audience knows too much about how much you had to do to get that one hit.
Yeah.
It kind of softens the impact of it. But
Yeah.
that's what you got to do, really. It's not like you can just make a video and then you're going to get 20 million views.
Right, and
Trial and error.
And it never even occurred to me that I could become kind of a minor celebrity in Chongqing, because I didn't see anything special about what I was doing. But after my wife started filming me in these little Douyin videos, I realized that when I go back to the States, I'm just a fat white guy, and when I'm in Chongqing, I'm a fat white guy that speaks Chongqing dialect. So, so I go home like when I went home last year. One of my cousins is an actress, and so I got to meet them because it was Christmas, and her mother, my aunt, was like, so I heard you're doing social media in China, and I said yeah, and she's like, so do you have followers? I said yeah, like 350,000, and she was just like 350,000. And I said, yeah, that's not much in China. It's really not that much.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's a neighborhood.
we're up to 570,000 now.
Yeah, that's still pretty remarkable.
Yeah, but we had to get up to 500,000 before media companies started contacting us saying we'd like to work with you, and so now we're talking to some media companies because we're starting to realize we have an opportunity to grow our fan base further by kind of focusing the content of what it is
Right.
we're putting out, making our own kind of
it
brand.
sounds like you've got a pretty good opportunity. You've got a pretty good opportunity now.
Yeah.
And I guess it's compounded because, first of all, you speak like the local dialect. You speak Mandarin in a local accent, so that's interesting in itself. But then I think a lot of the things that we consider ordinary, we take for granted that people here will say, oh, that's really interesting, like some of your videos from home.
Yeah.
And so I'm kind of doing it in reverse. I've been releasing some videos overseas about China, and people pick up on things that I never thought they'd pick up. So, for example, yesterday morning, or the morning before, I was in Hunan, and I was filming a video. It was a commentary on property in China. And I was in a dark alleyway. It was like 5 a.m. I got up really early. And I was filming the video, and people were saying, wow, you can just walk around in a dark alleyway and you're not afraid.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, wow, I never even considered. It's like, but you're right. Yeah, I mean, there's people in certain neighborhoods of Toronto or big cities where that you can't do this. And then so it makes me think about what are these other things that we take for granted that I can show other people. And then it even made me appreciate it more. Like today when I was walking through a dark stairway up the hospital or something like that, and you have somebody, coming up behind you or something like that, you don't even bat an eye. You don't care. It's like you feel really safe everywhere in China.
Yeah, and there's other things that I'm still learning too. I mean, you never stop learning really. And I don't know, is your wife from here?
She's from Jiangxi.
Okay. Yeah. One of the things that drove me nuts when I got married was the first few years, my wife was constantly saying things like it's too cold outside, put on another jacket, or it's too hot outside, take off your sweater, or there was just constant. And it's not just that, it's like a never-ending stream of suggestions and advice. And then she would often get angry with me and say, you're like an unemotional robot, like you just don't seem to care about anything. And it took years before I figured out that one thing was, we got into a big fight one time. This is maybe 2 years ago now. And it was because she was obviously tired, and we were in a shopping mall, and my friends were visiting from my hometown. And I said, do you want a cup of coffee? In Chinese, I said, "你要不要咖啡?" And she said, no. And then I said, well, you want some hot tea? No. You want some water? No. And then she got angry, and then we got into a big fight. And it took a few days before I figured out it, to her in Chongqing culture at any rate, by asking her over and over, yao biao, it's like a yao biao naga, do you want this? Do you want that? To her, it sounds like I don't really want to do it. And like, if I was a Chinese husband, I would just say anything. I'd just go get her a cup of coffee. But I'm from Minnesota. Like, even if I'm going to help somebody change a tire, I need to know the size of the lug nut just in case I need to get a wrench. And so I need to know what the right size is. I'm asking her if she wants coffee because I don't want her to go get her coffee and then have her say, I don't want coffee or something like that. So what do you want? And what she wants me to do is take care of her. And that's something that's so different between central Minnesota and Chongqing, is that in Minnesota, like, if I just go get a cup of hot chocolate for a girl I'm dating in Minnesota and walk up to her with it, she'll be like, you think I can't get my own hot chocolate?
Yeah.
Why didn't you ask me? Now we've wasted a cup of hot chocolate because I don't want hot chocolate. And so, but in China, like, it's the opposite.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I feel like she's constantly nitpicking. What she's doing is, in her own culture, she's showing me how much she cares about me.
Right. Yeah.
And she hates the fact that I'm a robot because I don't want to be overly nitpicky, because if I'm constantly saying, oh, be careful, or it's cold outside, or this or that or whatever.
Yeah, that's really a China-wide thing, isn't it? I mean, even not even within relationships, like husband and wife relationships. Like, when you're out, they just get you something and they put it in front of you.
Yep.
It's like, and it's to the point, certain things have changed. Before it was with cigarettes. Doesn't matter if you don't smoke. It's like, no, have one. I say, no, I don't smoke. Say, okay,
just take the cigarette.
Just take the cigarette. Then okay, you just put it in your ear.
Yeah. I that's what I used to tell people when I went home in 2001. They would say, what's the difference between the cultures? And they'd say, fruit. And they would be like, what do you mean fruit? And I'd say, I go to a friend's house, and as soon as I walk in the door, they pull out a bowl of fruit. And it doesn't matter if I've just walked through the Sahara Desert or the Gobi Desert, or if I just ate 6 pounds of oranges. I have to say, no, I'm not hungry, like 6 times.
Yeah.
And then whether or not I'm hungry, I have to eat a fucking orange. Like, it's okay. And then I eat the orange, and because they offered it. And so it's this cultural thing where it's way more considerate of everyone else.
It is, yeah.
When you know them. But if you're out in a subway, then you just jostle everybody around. There's no personal space. I think partly just because there's always been, even before World War II, there were a lot of people in China. There's always been a lot of people in China. So there's no personal space. So there's not much regard for strangers. In America, we're all waiting for everybody to get on and off the elevator, and we're all holding doors for each other and everything else.
That's.
But at the same time, my Chinese friends that I've known for 20 years, they're just almost as close to me as family members in the States. And I have good friendships in the States, but people that I've met in the States in the last 10, 15 years, I don't think I have the same level of a relationship as I do with my Chinese friends.
Yeah, you do get used to it, and there is something to say about it. And I remember when my son, when he was here, everybody talks to you. Well, first of all, when he was a baby, about personal space, they have every suggestion for you.
Right.
Oh, your baby should be wearing more clothes, or oh, you shouldn't be coming out before 3 months. You should be, all this stuff. It's like no personal space, and if you don't understand it, you get annoyed by it.
Right.
But we've got 4 kids now, so we know what's going on.
Yeah,
But the one thing though that where I said, okay, there's a lot of things I actually prefer here. Because my son, he's used to people outside talking to him and everything like that. But because everybody has their own personal space in America and in Canada, compounded by the fact that almost everybody's treated suspiciously.
Yeah.
When we were in a Walmart, my son was like waddling up to, I can't remember, he's like 2 years old, 2.5 years old, waddled up, somebody says hi, they want to talk to him.
Right.
But here they'll be so happy to talk to him.
Right.
It doesn't matter if it's a man or a woman or anything like that. Like, there's this community culture here, which definitely you get used to and you really begin to appreciate.
Yeah, and I occasionally am tempted to mess with people, although I never do. Like a couple of weeks ago, I was walking in, and I was holding my then, I guess, 5-month-old son, and I'm walking into the compound, and this nice uncle guy comes over, and he's like, "Oh, is that your son?" And I was so tempted to just look at him deadpan and say no. But yeah, I mean, they're more friendly and open. They're not afraid to give you suggestions, especially if there's 75-year-old grandmothers. But But at the same time, it's done from a position of caring.
It is, yeah. It's interesting when you really think about it. There's a portion of society here that's more direct.
Yeah.
They tell you exactly, oh, you shouldn't be doing this, you shouldn't be doing that, or you should put more clothes on your baby or something like that.
Right.
And then there's a portion that's indirect, where it's like, no, you shouldn't ask me for a coffee. You should just bring me one.
Right.
Like, if you really care. It's like, if you can imagine for somebody who just comes here and tries to understand it, they'll just be completely lost.
Yeah, and one of the other things that's really interesting, at least in my opinion, is that when I came over here in '97, that was when I really started studying the language and the culture and everything else. And I got over here, and I met on the first day another guy from Minnesota whose parents were University of Minnesota professors. And so when he was 8, he said randomly, I want to learn Chinese, because he saw like Enter the Dragon or something.
Okay.
And so his dad was like, all right. And he found him a Chinese tutor. And the guy could speak really good Chinese in '97 when he came over here. He'd only been in China for maybe a total of 6 months or something. And so we went out together, and I hooked up with my friend that I had met, a couple of guys I'd met in '94. They introduced me to a whole bunch of people they had met since then that I'm now friends with still. And all of them kind of didn't get along real well with my friend from Minnesota, who was from Minneapolis, who could speak fluent Chinese.
Oh.
But everybody got along really well with me. And eventually I figured out, I think the reason was because my friend that could speak Chinese really well, but he hadn't lived here for very long. Mm-hmm. And so he approached friendship with Chinese people from the perspective of somebody from a big city in Minnesota, and a big city anywhere in North America. If somebody says something that makes you feel uncomfortable, you kind of tell them, you're a little cold towards them. You're like, and I came from a really, really small town where if I let people know how I really felt about them, then word might get around that I'm an asshole. So growing up I don't know if you ever listen to NPR, like Lake Wobegon.
I haven't heard that. I listen to a lot of NPR stuff,
but there's a Minnesota public radio show. It's like a entertainment show, and I forget what it's called. But at any rate, Garrison Keillor.
Okay.
Anyway. And it delves very deeply into the whole idea of small town life in middle America. And there was this one guy in my group of friends that I'm now very good friends with, who originally just didn't really understand how to deal with foreigners, and none of them really did, but his solution was awkward. Like, he'd put his hand around your shoulders and squeeze your arm in a way that was very uncomfortable, and he would put his hand on your stomach or rub your stomach, rub your arm hair, and say uncomfortable things that were too direct or too personal.
I've got an employee like that.
Yeah. And so my friend from Minneapolis kind of backed away from that. And eventually they were like, you want to come out and get hot pot with us? And I'd say, yeah. And they'd be like, well, don't bring your friend though. And he understands probably a lot more about Chinese culture now than I do. But at the beginning, I connected more strongly with these guys, I think, mainly because I come from a small town.
Well, it's probably compounded by the fact also that if you were just learning Chinese and your Chinese wasn't good then, and here this guy comes along and he speaks really well, Chinese really well, he's not going to be given as much of an allowance to make mistakes, because they're going to think, well, you should know better. You're speaking Chinese, but you're speaking to us clearly. We understand clearly what you're saying. There's no misunderstanding.
Right.
So which is a double whammy for him.
Yeah. When I was here in '94, I had a friend, my roommate, who's Vietnamese American, but he immigrated from Vietnam when he was 12, and his grandparents one set of grandparents were from mainland China, and so he looked pretty Chinese even for a Vietnamese person. And after we had been in Beibei, this little suburb of Chongqing, for about 2 weeks, I was heading out of the foreign students building, and he said, hey, do you want to go get lunch? I said, sure. So we went to this little hole in the wall place, and the waitress came out, took one look at the two of us, and handed him the menu. And he couldn't speak any Chinese. My Chinese was terrible, but it was slightly better than his. And he took the menu and he looked at it for a couple of seconds and he picked out 4 things and handed the menu back to her. And I said, "Wait, you read Chinese?" And he said, "No."
Just randomly.
And I said, "What did we order?" And he said, "We'll find out in a minute." And he told me his method was they would, everything was usually handwritten in Chinese in 1997.
Yeah.
He would take the menu and he would go top left, top right, bottom right.
That was his code.
It would be like an appetizer, a veggie dish, a meat dish, and hopefully not baijiu. And but his approach to it was out of necessity. Like, I couldn't figure out that I could just do this. But if he tried to explain to people that he couldn't speak Chinese, sometimes they'd actually get a little bit upset with him because they'd be like, "What's wrong with you?" Because it would usually take people a minute to figure out that he wasn't actually Chinese.
Right, yeah.
And eventually he figured out how to say, "I'm American, I don't understand you." But for the first 3 weeks or so, his method of getting around, and he loved to be by himself. He was an artist. So he would go out to eat lunch on his own and people would just hand him a menu and he'd just pick things. And,
I've always wondered how that would work and how that dynamic would work because, there are people who maybe they're second, third generation Chinese living in the U.S. and they come over. And it's like your friend, but in a different aspect. So your friend is being judged for understanding Chinese, but not understanding culture.
Right.
And these other people are being judged for looking Chinese, but not actually being Chinese and understanding Chinese.
Yeah, exactly. And I had fun in 2008. An ABC friend of mine from Hawaii, she and I went to a pharmacy, and I could speak better Chinese than she could. So I acted as her translator, and the pharmacy lady would like, I would be talking and she'd be like looking over at me. And then when she asked a question, she had to look at my friend. Like, she wouldn't look at me when she asked a question in Chinese. She'd look at my friend and ask her the question, and then my friend would look at me, and then I would answer the question, and we'd go back over.
It's almost like it's not processing. It's
yeah,
like not,
she wasn't. And my Chinese friend and I, or my Chinese American friend of mine, and we were laughing. Like, we were trying so hard not to laugh because it was really entertaining for us.
Yeah.
But I do, that is something that I go back to time and again about Chongqing specifically, is it's a huge city that's not very international. And it's got its own culture. It doesn't even adapt other parts of the country. Like, it's only very recently that a few Xinjiang food chains started opening restaurants here. Other than that, maybe 6 years ago, it was really hard to find good Xinjiang food, and I love Xinjiang food. Yeah. So it's only now starting to pick up a lot of other cuisine from around China.
Are you finding it's like the younger population in Chongqing that's really pushing the lead, or are the older crowd? Is the older crowd coming out and trying new things now?
I think it's more younger people. Yeah. The younger generation.
That's where you'd expect it to start. Yeah.
Yeah, and China is unique in the fact that since the early 90s, they've had nothing but sustained economic growth. They haven't had a recession really to speak of. Yeah. And people talk about the economy slowing down now, but it's still growing.
Yeah. So what is it, like 6-7% growth? It's
something like low sixes, I think, right now. So it's still growing. It's growing slower than everybody would like it to grow, but it's definitely far from being a recession.
There's such an unrealistic expectation, though, that it's grown this fast, this long.
Well, and the other part of it is, at least in my opinion, is that China has 5 times as many people as the U.S. Yeah. And so even though their GDP is the second largest in the world at the moment,
per capita,
they have to be like 3 times bigger than the U.S. Before their purchasing power parity is anywhere close to where we're at.
I mean, it's interesting though, because so of course the per capita GDP is higher in the US than in China, but also the per capita kind of CO2 emissions and pollution is higher. And I can't remember who it was who said is they said they can't afford China to be as rich as the US, because if everybody in China, the population of China, was as wasteful as we are in the West, in Canada and the US and everything like that, it'd be a pretty big kind of economic issue. So I mean, it's great to see that they're pushing things through, like electric buses and all these things, and they're trying to stay on top of this. China's responsible for 25% of the world's reforestation. They're doing a lot in the environmental category, but it'll be interesting to see how this happens and how this unfolds, because that would be one of the concerns also.
Yeah, and I've been fascinated with seeing the growth. I've had a unique perspective because I left in 2001 and I came back. I came back for a visit in 2008. So between 2001 and 2008, the entire city of Chongqing changed drastically. And when I left in 2001, there was one like walking plaza street in Chongqing, and it was in Jiefenbei downtown. And now there's like 20. You know, there's city centers.
Yeah,
all
it's an
over.
interesting. There's a lot of credit that's really due here because I mean, it's not only the people who are moving fast and building businesses and growing the economy. I mean, the government has to keep up with this too. They have to keep the framework, the laws, the enforcement, and all this stuff because you can't just let the economy go. I think probably a good analogy for this is because I lived in one of those buildings that have 7 floors with no elevator. Also,
Yeah.
and those buildings were built before everybody really had multiple air conditioning units in the building. But then as soon as they start coming in, the transformer box on the first floor starts exploding.
Right.
I'm sure they've had that here too.
Yeah.
And so it's almost like if you look at the whole country, you've got to imagine that there's a risk of that happening too. It's a really delicate balance to make sure everything keeps up together.
Yeah, when I lived, I was teaching at a university here in 1998, and they replaced my washing machine, and the washing machine they brought in, the new one, was it was still like an old 90s Chinese washing machine, but it was a higher wattage.
Yeah, probably had a heating element or something, or
I'm not sure. It spun. The engine was bigger. The spin cycle engine was bigger.
Yeah.
So I couldn't have. I had to unplug my refrigerator and
to
use my washing machine, and then eventually, and I would forget, and then the power would trip for my whole unit, and then I called the electrical guy one time, and he comes up, and he opens the electrical box, and their fuse was a soft wire that just went in between the two contactors, and so if that thing overheated, it would melt.
Right.
And so he walks into my apartment, and he comes back out with a clothes hanger, and he just takes a section of clothes hanger, which is way stronger and it's not going to melt, and just hardwired so now I can use my washing machine and my fridge at the same time, but I'm overloading the power to my entire unit, and I'm risking burning out all of my appliances. And so I would and then I'd have friends over, and somebody'd be like, "Hey, can I watch some TV?" And I'd be like, "Hold on a second,
unplug something."
I'd go turn off a light, I'd be like, "These are on the same circuit, so now you can watch TV."
Yeah.
So it really, I mean, the changes between then and now are phenomenal. I mean, now we have circuit breakers all over the place. And
right.
It's a lot safer. But that's the other thing. I mean, starting a business like this, I got into the craft beer business originally because I saw Shenzhen, Shanghai, Beijing were all growing craft beer markets, and Chongqing wasn't. And you generally have, in my opinion, somewhere between 2 and 5 years between Shanghai adopting something and Chongqing adopting it. So I figured I had a little time. And then I was making beer and meeting my Chinese friends for Hot Pot. And after, I don't know, back in 2015 or 2016, they were like, you should consider opening a brew pub. And then my consulting contract was coming to an end, and I said, I think I'd like to try and do that. And then they called me up, one of them, and said, you should go to testbed. And then I said, okay. And so I looked around, and then another week goes by, and the same person calls me up, and she says, you should talk to, this guy. And I'm like, okay. So I go talk to that guy, and then she's like, did you pick a place? And I was like, yeah. She's like, you should tell him this much for rent. And so I was all worried about finding a place and negotiating a contract and not getting screwed over and everything. And instead I just used 20-year-old guanxi and didn't even know I was using it. I mean, they wanted me to open a brew pub. So they were like, do this, do this, do this. Yeah. We already figured this out. Just go ahead and do that.
Yeah.
And so I came in here, and we originally set up all our equipment in the brew pub, and we were making beer in here. But then the whole place became a Wang Hong destination, and the regulations were already in place for brew pub requirements for a brew pub, and my little brew pub never met those requirements, but it was originally not a problem. And then when this place started getting flooded with people, they came out and they said, you can't make beer in here.
Yeah, that tends to happen here.
Yeah. And it was funny too. 3 guys walked in and they're like, the guy in the middle does all the talking. He's like, you can't make beer in here. And I said, but you guys said I could make beer. And he's like, who told you could make beer? And I said, he did. And I pointed at the guy to his right. And that was the wrong answer.
I guess
so. I mean, I didn't get any trouble, but they were like, regulations have changed. You can't do it.
Yeah,
so
I mean, a lot of this stuff is being handed down also, right? It's like, okay, you guys have to stay on top of this now. And I think it's kind of good that it worked out like this, that there was a flexibility built in the beginning.
Yeah.
Get people, get their foot in the door, and then it's like, okay, now we got to clean things up and just you got to update your, your whole situation and everything like that. And we've had that happen also.
And at least in my experience up until now, people have been pretty understanding. I mean, we make good beer. People don't have any problems after they drink the beer, and the quality is there. So if we run into a problem, they're pretty forgiving about it. They just say, look, you gotta change this, and usually we haven't run into anything yet that's been unsurmountable.
Did you ever have a situation? I know we got to wrap this up soon. We're way over your time. So, just finishing on the question, I don't know if you noticed the same thing happening in Chongqing, but obviously with the society growing really fast and the government trying to keep up with everything, also sometimes they overshoot or they overreact to things. So, for example, like if in our neighborhood somebody gets food poisoning at a restaurant down the road, well, then everybody's going to have a hard time after that. They're going to come in and they're going to, really.
We really haven't had too much trouble with any of that. I mean, one of the upsides to it is our first bar is located in an area that's full of mostly younger people that are starting their own businesses, and because there's so much tourism here, even though it's still hard to make the businesses profitable, people are very aware of the quality standards that they need to meet. So we haven't, to my knowledge, there's been no problems with any of these locations. We've now got two other restaurants or 2 other bars, but they are also in areas that are kind of high end.
Okay.
Chongqing China and then up in Chibo. So those places are also really in fact one of the one up in Chibo in Yubei in the north end. We ended up opening next to a coffee shop called Coffeeholic, and they also have their flagship stores here in this area. And it was just random. We found a good spot.
Yeah.
And I was looking at it, and the owner of Coffeeholic came out, and he's like, "What are you doing here?" I was like, "What are you doing here?" He's like, "That's my store." So they helped us out a little bit
nice.
when we were getting going.
All right, well, we better wrap this up because I know you've got people waiting for you. So
sorry.
no worries. We should finish on because we never mentioned your brew pub name, your and then your signature beer. We'll finish with that.
The brew pub was originally called Riverside Brewing in English.
I remember that.
And then in Chinese it was called Benjingyang Pijiu, which it still is, which means stupid craft beer, basically. And I called it that because my Chinese name is Hebian, which means riverside.
Yep.
And then my English name is Ben, which means stupid. But then Reddit changed my name because somebody on Reddit posted, they said they were going over to Chongqing. Where can I get a craft, a pint and pint of craft beer? And then somebody said, oh, there's Ben's Bar. And everybody kept calling it Ben's Bar. And so we changed the name to Ben's Bar. Because it was
and
just
3 locations now.
3 locations, and then we've got the flagship beer is the Sichuan pepper beer.
And you sell that online also on
We
Taobao.
sell that on Taobao as well.
So what's the best way that people can find it if they want to? The Weibo account
the best way to find it is to go on Taobao and just type in Huajiao Pijiu in Chinese, and
you'll be on there.
And the picture that shows our beer is me holding it.
Okay.
So that people are like, oh, that's the Laowai's beer.
Yeah.
Because there are actually about 5 or 6 different Sichuan pepper beers that I'm able to find on Taobao. Sometimes you got to scroll down a little bit because it'll put random non-Sichuan pepper beer up in front.
Yeah, but if they see your picture, it's easy to make a copy of the beer, but not actually that would be difficult also, but not of you. So they'd have to search pretty hard to find somebody who looks the same.
Yeah,
Teach them to speak in a Chongqing accent if you've got a video on there.
Exactly.
But anyways, let's wrap this up so you can go. So we'll there were so many other things we could cover, so maybe we can do that next time.
Yeah. We'll come down to Shenzhen.
Yeah, you definitely have to. All right, so we'll wrap it up here.
All right, thanks.
Yeah, cheers.
Cheers.
We should have had a beer, but.